The grand hall was buzzing with excitement that evening. Spectators gathered around to witness the brilliance of the Grandmaster, whose reputation stretched across continents. He was known not only for his genius at the board but also for his sharp humor and confidence that bordered on arrogance. Every move he made was celebrated, every word he spoke carried weight. As the games continued, he scanned the crowd looking for a way to entertain himself further. His eyes fell on a modest woman standing quietly at the edge of the hall. She wore simple clothes, her hands folded gently in front of her as she watched with quiet interest. There was nothing about her that suggested she belonged among the polished players and eager competitors. With a smirk, the Grandmaster called out to her. "Come sit and play," he said, his tone laced with amusement. The audience chuckled, assuming it was another one of his jokes. The woman hesitated, but the eyes of the room were now fixed on her, leaving little room to refuse. She walked forward slowly, her steps steady, though her expression remained calm. Taking the seat across from the Grandmaster, she placed her hands on the table lightly, as if she had done so many times before. The board was set, the pieces gleaming under the bright lights. The crowd leaned closer, curious to see how long she would last before faltering. The Grandmaster made his opening move swiftly, without much thought. He assumed the game would be quick, a spectacle to amuse the audience before he returned to serious matches. But when the modest woman moved her first piece, the atmosphere shifted. Her motion was quiet, deliberate, and filled with a certainty that caught even the Grandmaster off guard. The audience exchanged glances, whispers running through the hall. Could she actually know the game, they wondered? Her eyes remained fixed on the board, unbothered by the crowd or the smirk across the table. The Grandmaster leaned back in his chair, studying her with a new kind of interest. Move by move, the game unfolded. At first, the Grandmaster played carelessly, still believing it to be an easy victory. But soon he noticed the strange precision in her moves, the way she built quiet traps with every turn. What seemed simple at first began to weave into a strategy that was hard to ignore. The modest woman never raised her voice, never showed pride. She only looked at the board, her face calm, her hands steady. The Grandmaster frowned slightly, adjusting in his chair for the first time that evening. The audience fell quieter, leaning closer, sensing something unexpected was taking place. Piece after piece shifted across the board like soldiers in an unseen war. The Grandmaster tried to strike boldly, but each attempt met with a quiet answer. The woman's patience was unnerving. She moved with no rush, yet her decision struck with precision. The crowd no longer chuckled. Instead, they held their breath, waiting for what would come next. The Grandmaster tapped his fingers against the table, his smile fading little by little. He had invited her as a joke, but now the game no longer felt like amusement. The board was slowly turning into a battlefield where his every misstep carried weight. He leaned closer, studying the pieces with the intensity he reserved only for serious opponents. The modest woman remained unchanged, her calmness almost unsettling. Her eyes traced the board with the quiet focus of someone who saw more than what lay before them. When she lifted her hand to move a piece, it was never rushed, never hesitant. Each motion felt as though it had been decided long before the moment arrived. The audience grew restless, whispering among themselves. "Is she winning?" someone murmured. The question lingered in the air like a challenge. Spectators who once expected a quick defeat now found themselves gripping their seats, unable to look away. The Grandmaster made a bold move, sacrificing a piece to break her defense. The crowd gasped at his daring strategy. But the modest woman answered with a quiet shift of her own. Her reply dismantled his attack, as though she had been waiting for it all along. The Grandmaster sat back, his eyes narrowing. For the first time that night, he was forced to admit he could no longer play carelessly. He straightened his posture, his hand resting on his chin as he studied the board with true concentration. The hall fell silent, sensing that the tone of the match had changed completely. The modest woman, however, did not seem affected. Her breathing was steady, her gaze fixed, her movements precise. It was as though the noise of the hall had vanished for her, leaving only the board and the game that unfolded. The Grandmaster moved again, carefully testing her resolve. Once more her answer was exact, swift, and undeniable. The crowd erupted in astonishment, their whispers rising to stunned murmurs. The Grandmaster glanced at her, searching for some sign of pride or triumph. But her face remained still, her focus unbroken, as if the game itself was speaking through her. The Grandmaster felt a bead of sweat on his brow, something he had not known at the board in many years. The crowd leaned closer, their eyes darting between the shifting pieces and the calm figure of the modest woman. Every move she made seemed to strip away his options, cornering him little by little. What began as a joke was turning into a lesson, one that weighed heavier with each passing turn. He tried to mask his unease with a faint smile, but his hands betrayed him, moving slower than before. The audience noticed, and their whispers grew louder, filling the hall with tension. The modest woman did not look up, not even once. Her gaze stayed fixed, her expression quiet, her movements flowing like water across the board. The Grandmaster pushed forward with another daring strike. He sacrificed a rook to open a path for his queen, believing this time he had forced her into danger. But the modest woman met his challenge with a single calm move. Her knight leapt into place, and the path he had created collapsed instantly, leaving his pieces scattered. Gasps echoed through the hall. The spectators could hardly believe what they were seeing. The Grandmaster now leaned both elbows on the table, his sharp eyes narrowing as he studied the board with full force. This was no longer a playful distraction, this was a true battle. The modest woman finally raised her eyes for the briefest moment. She looked at the Grandmaster not with pride, not with mockery, but with quiet understanding. Then she returned her gaze to the board and prepared her next move. The Grandmaster felt the weight of that glance more than any word she could have spoken. The silence in the room grew heavy. Even the sound of the clock ticking beside the board seemed thunderous. Every spectator waited, holding their breath, as the modest woman's hand hovered over the pieces. And when she finally moved, the hall seemed to tremble with the realization of what was unfolding before them. The modest woman placed her bishop with quiet certainty, and the room gasped as the trap revealed itself. What had looked like scattered moves now formed a pattern sharp and unbreakable. The Grandmaster froze, his eyes darting across the board, trying to calculate a path out. But every direction was sealed, every piece bound by the quiet net she had spun around him. The audience leaned forward, gripping the edges of their seats. Some covered their mouths in disbelief, others shook their heads in silence. The Grandmaster, who had mocked her, now looked as though he were the one being tested. His hand hovered above the pieces, trembling ever so slightly. The modest woman sat still, her hands folded in her lap, as though she had all the time in the world. There was no sign of triumph on her face, no flicker of pride. She simply waited, calm and unbothered, while the greatest player in the room searched desperately for answers. The silence stretched long and heavy, pressing against every heart present. At last the Grandmaster moved his queen, trying to claw back control. The spectators murmured, thinking perhaps he had found a way. But the modest woman leaned forward, her eyes never leaving the board. Her fingers lifted a single pawn and pushed it forward with a quiet grace. The hall erupted in gasps again. That one simple move cut through the Grandmaster's defense like a blade. His queen was trapped, his king exposed, the glittering pieces he had relied on now cornered. He stared at the board, unable to hide the disbelief in his eyes. The modest woman lowered her hands, once more her expression unchanged. It was as if she had seen the end of the game from the very first move. And now the Grandmaster realized he was not leading the joke, he was living it. The audience waited in hushed awe, their eyes fixed on the woman who had turned the entire match upside down. The Grandmaster leaned closer, his sharp eyes scanning the board with fierce intensity. Every calculation he made seemed to collapse against the quiet pattern the modest woman had set in place. He tried to imagine 3 moves ahead, then 5, then 10, but every path circled back into her waiting net. For the first time in years, his mind felt heavy, as if weighed down by her silence. The crowd had grown restless, yet no one dared to speak too loudly. All they could do was watch the pieces shift slowly across the board. Every move she made carried a stillness that seemed unshakable. Every response from him felt rushed, as though he were trying to catch up to a rhythm only she could hear. The modest woman adjusted a rook, sliding it neatly into position. The Grandmaster felt his breath catch in his chest. It was not an attack, not yet, but a tightening of the rope around him. The audience noticed too, and a wave of murmurs spread through the hall. He moved a knight forward, striking boldly, but the attempt fell flat. She countered with precision, her eyes never lifting from the board. Piece by piece his army began to shrink, while hers only grew stronger in unity. The board was no longer his battleground, it was hers. The Grandmaster rested his chin on his hand, staring at the modest woman. Her calm face gave nothing away. It was as though she had already accepted the outcome and was simply guiding him toward it. The audience leaned in, holding their breath as though they too knew the end was drawing closer. The Grandmaster moved again, slower, now more cautious. But with every turn the modest woman's pieces pressed deeper. Her pawns advanced like quiet footsteps, her bishops sliced across the board, her queen lingered like a shadow. The air in the hall grew heavier with each passing second as the Grandmaster realized he was no longer in control. The Grandmaster shifted in his chair, his hand hovering above the board before pulling back. He could hear the ticking of the clock louder than the murmurs of the audience. The modest woman sat across from him, steady as stone, her calmness unbroken by the weight of so many eyes. Her silence spoke louder than words, reminding him that this was no longer a display, but a true contest. He pushed his rook forward in a desperate attempt to shield his king. The audience leaned forward, sensing his unease. The modest woman studied the board for only a moment before moving her queen with quiet certainty. The hall erupted in gasps, her piece slicing through his defense as if it had always been meant to. The Grandmaster clenched his jaw, his pride bruised, yet his focus sharpened. He had faced champions across the world, yet never had he felt this strange pressure. It was not the weight of fame or competition, it was the weight of being understood. She seemed to see every corner of his mind, every pattern he tried to weave before he could finish it. Another move, another answer. He brought forward his knight, but she dismantled its path in a single stroke. His bishop struck out, but her pawn blocked it with flawless timing. The crowd sat stunned as the Grandmaster, known for brilliance, seemed to unravel before their eyes. The modest woman finally raised her eyes, meeting his gaze with a look that was soft but firm. There was no pride in her stare, no mocking smile, only quiet certainty. The Grandmaster shifted back, uneasy under the calm weight of her presence. She lowered her gaze once more and moved a rook into place, closing the space around his king. The audience burst into murmurs, unable to contain themselves. The end was not yet here, but it was drawing closer with every turn. The Grandmaster felt his hands grow heavier as though each move demanded more than he had to give. And across from him the modest woman sat, unchanged, guiding the board as though she had always belonged there. The Grandmaster leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at the tightening pattern before him. Every line he traced with his thoughts ended in the same quiet trap. The modest woman had woven the board into a cage, and he was caught at the center. He tapped his finger against the table, a faint sound echoing through the hall. The audience grew silent, once more their anticipation heavy in the air. They had expected laughter, they had expected a quick victory, but what they saw now was history unfolding. The modest woman moved her bishop across the board with a steady hand. The piece slid into place, and the Grandmaster's shoulders stiffened. He tried to respond with care, moving his queen to hold ground. But her reply came swift and clean, a pawn shifting forward to cut his defenses in half. The crowd gasped, some rising slightly from their seats. What seemed so small had suddenly opened a path that threatened everything he had left. The Grandmaster adjusted in his chair, wiping his brow, though the hall was cool. His mind raced faster than his hands, but the woman across from him looked untouched by the strain. Her stillness was unnerving, her patience endless. It was as if the game belonged to her long before the first move had been made. The audience could hardly believe the sight before them. The Grandmaster, once known for brilliance, now sat struggling against a player no one had expected. The modest woman remained quiet, her eyes soft, her movements precise. Each turn she took drew him further into the spiral she had built. The Grandmaster set his knight forward in a last attempt to spark an opening. But she answered with her queen sliding into the perfect square. The crowd erupted in disbelief, their voices rising as the Grandmaster froze. He could see what was coming, and he knew he had no way to stop it. The Grandmaster stared at the board, his fingers hovering above the pieces, but refusing to land. Every path his mind traced was already closed, every doorway sealed before he could step through. The modest woman sat across from him, unshaken, her presence calm, as though she were listening to something no one else could hear. The silence between them grew heavier than the applause of any crowd he had ever known. The audience whispered nervously, their eyes wide as the pattern became clear. Some leaned in closer while others covered their mouths, unable to believe what was unfolding. The Grandmaster shifted his queen back in retreat, a move unworthy of his name, but the only one he could see. The modest woman lowered her gaze and slid her rook across the board with steady hands. Gasps swept through the hall as the rook landed perfectly, locking his king into a shrinking corner. The Grandmaster leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight, his pride caught between anger and awe. Never had he been pressed like this, never had an opponent so quiet forced him into such silence. He reached forward again, his hand trembling slightly as he nudged a pawn into motion. The woman answered without hesitation, her knight leaping forward with surgical precision. The trap grew tighter, the edges of the board folding in on him like walls closing around a prisoner. The Grandmaster swallowed hard, feeling every eye in the room fixed upon him. For the first time in his life, he was not the performer, he was the lesson. The audience no longer laughed, they no longer whispered with doubt. They watched in reverence as the modest woman guided the game with patience that seemed timeless. Her face never changed, her eyes never wavered, her every move carved deeper into his pride. The Grandmaster exhaled slowly, knowing the board no longer belonged to him. The Grandmaster pressed his palms together, leaning closer, as though sheer focus could bend the board to his will. His thoughts raced, chasing after lines of play, but every possibility slipped into the same quiet defeat. The modest woman rested her hands lightly in her lap, her posture unchanging as if she had all the time in the world. Her eyes followed the pieces with patience that seemed deeper than calculation. He slid his bishop across the board, desperate to create some room for his king. But the move only revealed another weakness, and the audience gasped as they saw it. The woman raised her hand calmly and moved her queen into the perfect square. Her piece stood like a sentinel, the board now fully under her command. The Grandmaster flinched almost imperceptibly. He had faced champions who fought with fire and ferocity, but never one who fought with silence. She gave nothing away, no triumph, no mockery, just the steady rhythm of truth in her play. It unsettled him more than any roar of an opponent ever could. The audience grew restless, their whispers rising and falling like waves against stone. Some could hardly believe what they were witnessing, others already knew what the end would be. The Grandmaster tapped the table with his fingers before pushing his rook into place. It was a defensive move, thin and fragile like paper in a storm. The modest woman tilted her head only slightly and then moved her knight forward. The crowd erupted once more as the knight landed with a precision that left his king cornered again. The Grandmaster stared at the piece, his eyes widening as the board revealed its cruel pattern. Every move he had made was being folded back against him. He sat frozen for a moment, his pride clashing with the truth before him. And still the modest woman sat quiet, waiting for him to take the next step. The hall felt suspended in time, every breath held for what would come next. The Grandmaster let his hand hover above the board one last time before pulling it back. His mind searched frantically for an escape, but there was none. The modest woman had closed every door and sealed every path with quiet certainty. The weight of the hall pressed down upon him, and for the first time in his life, he felt small before the game. He exhaled slowly and pushed his final piece forward, though he knew it would change nothing. The woman looked at the board with calm, steady eyes, then moved her queen into place. The sound of the piece landing seemed to echo through the silence. Checkmate. The audience erupted, their voices rising in disbelief and awe. Some clapped with thunderous applause, others simply stared as though they had witnessed something beyond imagination. The Grandmaster leaned back in his chair, his pride wounded, yet his spirit strangely light. For in her silence, she had shown him a truth he had long forgotten. The modest woman did not smile nor bow to the crowd. She simply lowered her hands and sat quietly, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The applause washed over her, but she remained untouched by it. She had not come to win, she had come because she was asked. The Grandmaster rose to his feet and looked at her with new eyes. He extended his hand across the table, his voice soft though the room roared around them. Well played. The woman lifted her gaze, meeting his with humility, and placed her hand gently in his. The hall grew louder with cheers and gasps, but in that small moment, at the board, it was only the two of them. The master, who had mocked, and the woman who had answered with truth. And as the crowd celebrated, the lesson lingered quietly. Greatness can wear the face of the humble, and strength can rise from the silent.